It's the 18th of April 2026, and we're in Indio, California, at one of the most iconic music festivals in the world, Coachella. The indie rock band The Strokes takes the stage and delivers a striking political statement. Picture this. The band is performing its song Oblivious when LED screens display images condemning Washington's history of foreign interventions in the late 20th century. The video ends with footage of the demolition of Al-Isra University in Gaza by Israeli forces in 2024. Recently, the Middle East has dominated headlines, from the ongoing conflict in Iran and Lebanon to the ensuing energy crisis, now named the biggest in history. But this week, the situation in Gaza has returned to the spotlight, and not only because of the Strokes' performance. Important meetings took place in Brussels and Luxembourg earlier this week to discuss a two-state solution between Israel and Palestine and redefine the EU's relationship with Israel. Hello, and welcome to Brussels, My Love, the podcast, Euronews' weekly show on European and EU politics. I'm Lauren Walker, and I'll be your host for the day. On this Friday, the 24th of April, I'm joined by two guests. Martin Konečný of the European Middle East Project. Thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be here.
And Vincenzo Genovese, Euronews' EU reporter and is a former presenter of the Italian edition of Brussels, My Love. How does it feel to be on the other side, Vincenzo?
Hello, Lauren. It's always a pleasure, I would say, to be in Brussels, My Love.
Oh, that's lovely. Well, welcome back. So as we said, it was a busy foreign policy week for the European Union and also the bloc's ties with Israel and Palestine. Let's start with the latest developments. On Tuesday, Germany and Italy blocked a bid to end the EU association agreement with Israel. The proposal was tabled by Spain, Ireland and Slovenia. The full suspension was also called for by more than 1 million European citizens through a cross-border petition. Let's have a listen to EU High Representative Kaja Kallas talking to the press in Luxembourg following the outcome.
Given that the suspension of the association agreement needs anonymity, there was no support for this needed in the room. And the measures that we have already on the table that require qualified majority will require states shifting their position. We didn't see that today, but these discussions will continue.
Now, Martin, I'll turn to you. Let's take a step back. Tell us, what exactly is the EU-Israel Association Agreement? How significant is this partnership? And maybe more specifically, what part of the agreement was the proposal tackling?
So the association agreement is, in the first place, a trade agreement. It's a free trade agreement which provides for preferential trade between EU and Israel. And it's very significant because the EU is Israel's largest trading partner. So also for the EU, this is maybe the main source of leverage that it has vis-a-vis Israel. Now, the proposal that has been on the table for partial suspension of the association agreement deals precisely with this trade component, which I would say is the main part. And then there are additional parts of the association agreement. For example, it provides a foundation for cooperation and funding on research between the EU and Israel. So that comes on top of that. And there is also the idea of suspending the association agreement in full, but that would require unanimity in the Council, whereas if you only suspend a component, the trade part, that can be done with qualified majority of member states.
Okay, and obviously, under the agreement, Israel must uphold human rights obligations. And an EU review last year found that Israel was actually in breach of this agreement due to its actions in Gaza. Some saw this as a clear obligation why the agreement should be reviewed or even suspended. Obviously, Israel has rejected the review and they said that they were engaged in an existential struggle by defending it against the shared enemies of the West. So why is this being discussed again? Why was it not annulled the last time after this review?
Because you are very rightly pointing to the review of Israel's compliance with the Human Rights Clause, which took place last year and which concluded that Israel is in breach of the Human Rights Clause. The Human Rights Clause isn't just some kind of nice addition in the agreement. It's an essential clause in the agreement, formally. So if the EU concludes that this has been violated, there logically has to be some action. Otherwise, It sends a signal that we don't even take our own agreements, our own principles seriously. Why suspension has not happened? Well, because the member states are divided on this, and because some member states are very deeply attached to Israel. If we focus on what happened this week at the Foreign Affairs Council, I would not only single out Germany and Italy, but I would also point out member states such as France, Sweden, and Denmark, which also were not really supportive of the suspension, although they did support it previously. And I think this also played a key role, because the dynamic, if the EU actually moves forward when it comes to policy on Israel, but also on other issues, it is often the Franco-German motor. And on this issue, often France has to lead and Germany not oppose. But if the French do not lead and other member states around them, then it's easier for Germany and Italy to say no.
Interesting. And you touched a bit there on why Tuesday's meeting didn't lead to the measures that the proposal had put forward. Vincenzo, there's quite a divide there when you look at what Italy is doing on the EU level compared to what it's doing domestically, because Italy did vote against this bid on the EU level, but then nationally decided not to renew its defense agreement with Israel. And I quote, because of the current situation. Maybe to give some context there as well, UN peacekeepers were shot at in Lebanon, and Tajani, the Italian Foreign Affairs Minister, condemned this, which kind of led to a diplomatic spat there.
Italy's position is, as often happens, a kind of balancing act, as we always do, I would say. First of all, Italy suspended the automatic renewal of the defense agreement, which does not necessarily mean that this defense agreement will not be renewed in the future. But yes, is a first shift, let's say. We are seeing growing frictions between Italy and Israel, also for what is happening in Lebanon, where we know there are Italian soldiers with the UNIFIL troops. Probably this is not enough to justify a radical change by the Giorgia Meloni government. Let me quote, Lauren, the official position on the EU-Israel agreement that was provided to me by the Italian Foreign Ministry. Italy will adopt a serious and balanced approach, bearing in mind that there must be no negative consequences for the Israeli civilian population. So it's a way to say, in my view, we are not that happy with this agreement, but we will not vote to suspend it. In general, I think that Meloni government has been slowly shifting position on the topic, even because there is a strong public opinion in Italy against the Netanyahu government, and a public opinion which is very, very worried for the human rights violation in Gaza, of course, also in Lebanon, in the Middle East in general. And this, I think, has an impact. We saw this impact, for example, when Meloni said she was ready to recognize the state of Palestine, which was unprecedented.
And you mentioned the public opinion there. I'd also like to bring in, Martin, some UN experts. They were among those calling for the immediate suspension, so not the proposal on the table this week. Is the EU-Israel Association Agreement undermining the EU's credibility in the international arena, do you think?
That credibility has been already, I would say, shredded quite thoroughly over the past years because of the broader EU stance on the war in Gaza and its failure to even condemn, not only sanction, but even to properly condemn the Israeli attacks on the civilian population in Gaza, for example. And I think here it's not only our credibility when it comes to international law, but it's also our credibility when it comes to the respect of our own law, our own agreements, because this human rights clause, that's our clause, it's our invention to insert these clauses into our agreements. And finally, I think it's not only about our credibility, but it's also about our relevance and influence. And I think that if we fail to take action, if there are, again, no consequences, then we are sending the signal that basically the EU doesn't count, that the Israeli government doesn't need to pay attention to the concerns being voiced by the EU, because there will be no consequences.
That's a concern that is also shared by José Manuel Álvarez, Spanish Minister of Foreign Affairs. Let's listen to him talking to journalists on Tuesday before the meeting.
What I expect is that every European country obeys with what the International Court of Justice of the United Nations says, that we uphold human rights, that we defend international law. Anything different will be a defeat for European Union. And today we play, and I want to highlight that, we play our credibility in what we say.
Vincenzo, how might this conversation evolve in the coming months? Do you think it will continue?
In my opinion, it will continue, and much will depend on the public opinion, because we see that the broad topic Israel-Gaza is one that is very, very concerning for the public opinion in many European countries. And in my opinion, this has also provoked some shifts in the government's positions in the past. What I can say is that there will be changes in the governments in some countries. The most notable one is Hungary. We know that Viktor Orban was the staunchest supporter of Israel, probably. Hungary so far has blocked any attempt by the EU to have a stronger position on Israel, even to sanction the extremist settlers, which is something that all the other countries agree on. Let's see if this Peter Magyar, the new Hungarian prime minister, could change this stance, and we are not sure about that for the moment. Also speaking with our colleague Sándor Siros, who is our guide on Hungarian transition, he told me that is not quite clear what Magyar will do.
And Martin, just a final question on this trade agreement. Do you think the attention or the focus will shift to more specific measures like imposing tariffs on goods originating, for example, from Israeli settlements as proposed by France and Sweden?
Yes, in the short term, that is the focus in the EU institutions, and they may develop a proposal on this in the coming weeks. And I think this is a very important issue. The International Court of Justice 2 years ago stated that states are obliged to prevent trade with the illegal settlements, which benefits the Israeli occupation. And yet the EU continues to trade with them, although we have been calling them illegal for many years. Also, the EU's trade with settlements, it's maybe relatively small compared to the much larger trade between EU and Israel. But if you compare it to our trade with the Palestinians, according to estimates, it's maybe 10 or 15 times larger. So it is an important issue. But again, we see a tendency by member states to be extremely cautious and kind of tiptoe around the problem, which they have neglected, I would say, for many years. And they are talking about higher tariffs. But I think what should be on the table is a full ban on the imports from the settlements. If they are illegal, why should we be trading with them?
And now, so far we've discussed the meeting that happened on Tuesday in Luxembourg, but on Monday, another meeting took place here in Brussels. The EU High Representative Kaja Kallas co-hosted a conference attended by Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammad Mustafa. It was the 9th meeting of the Global Alliance for the Implementation of a Two-State Solution, and it was attended by representatives of more than 60 nations. Martin, remind us, what is this Global Alliance? What's the EU's role within this alliance?
So it is a joint initiative of the EU and Saudi Arabia and Norway, which was initiated actually under the previous High Representative Borrell. And it was started as a sort of a response to the crisis in Gaza with the idea that what happened in Gaza and what happened on the 7th of October 2023 is a consequence of a failure to bring about the two-state solution, which the EU and the international community advocated for many years. But that did not happen. And what we have seen since 2023 is a consequence of that. So there is an idea, there needs to be a renewed push to actually implement this solution, not just to talk about it, but to actually take concrete steps to implement it. However, I have to say that the Global Alliance so far, in my eyes, has not lived up to this commitment or ambition. And most of what we hear from it is, again, talk, but very little action. And that's why I think its impact so far has been unfortunately limited.
Before I get to you, Vincenzo, let's have another listen to EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas.
We can and must do more to ensure respect for human rights and accountability to protect the Palestinian people and to put the two-state solution solidly on the table again. And this is the only way that both the Palestinians and Israelis can live in safety, dignity, and peace.
Vincenzo, I want to ask you about something that Martin also touched on there, but get a bit more into the nitty-gritty of how the EU works. Do you think that if structural reforms were introduced in the EU, such as removing veto powers or no longer requiring unanimity on certain topics, the EU would be maybe more influential in the Middle East? Or is the issue not purely structural?
By removing the veto power and unanimity, I think you get more influential in many areas, or at least you have the possibility to become more influential on a geopolitical level, to act like a state, basically. I'm not sure what the EU will do without unanimity in this specific case, because we can see that also the so-called the top jobs, the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, the High Representative, Kaja Kallas, they are not fully supporting an hard stance against Israel, an hard use of the leverage, as Martin said, to achieve this two-state solution. Because at the end of the day, if the European Union wants a two-state solution, it should put its weight behind it. So diplomacy with the leverage is better than diplomacy without leverage. This specific matter is so delicate, and there is and is so divisive between European countries, but also among the different leaders, among the different politicians, that is difficult to see a clear path. I remember, for example, when the Israel-Hamas war broke out in 2023, there were different positions, even between von der Leyen and Josep Borrell, who was the High Representative, the EU Foreign Affairs Policy Chief. So I don't know if in this specific case, without the unanimity, all problems will be solved.
Martin Konečný and Vincenzo Genovese, thank you so much for this incredibly interesting conversation. Before we leave, tomorrow, the 25th of April, is an important day for both Portugal and Italy. In Portugal, it marks the 52nd anniversary of the Carnation Revolution, a military-led movement in Portugal that took down the right-wing authoritarian regime, leading the country to democracy. And in Italy, it marks the country's liberation from Nazi fascism. So, Vincenzo, since you're an Italian, are you going to mark this celebration?
Yes, Lauren. And there are many events also here in Brussels. As you know, we are a big community. There is a big community of Italians in this city. My personal routine on 25 Aprile, on April 25, is reading aloud a poem written by Piero Calamandrei and dedicated to a Nazi Field Marshal, Albert Kesselring. And it calls Lo avrai, camerata Kesselring. It's in Italian, but if you want to try, it's a suggestion.
Fantastic. Thank you. Unfortunately, that's all for today's episode of Brussels My Love, the podcast. Thank you all for listening, and enjoy the 25th of April and the rest of your weekend. This show was created by Maeve McMahon. This episode was written and produced by Alice Carnavali and presented by me, Lauren Walker. Thank you also to all those behind the scenes here at Euronews, our sound technician, Yorgos Livadidis, and our social media aide, Rebecca Spezzano. If you aren't already, you can listen to the series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us on Euronews.com or the Euronews YouTube channel. And if you like what you hear, subscribe to Brussels My Love, the podcast, leave us a review, give us a rating, and of course, spread the word. See you next time.